Hey everyone, and welcome to this Retail Reset conversation. I'm Alicia Esposito, Senior Content Strategist for Retail Touchpoints, and today I'm thrilled to have joining me Jason Goldberg, who is Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at Publicis. And I'm sure a lot of you know Jason, whether it's from his lecture circuit, his podcast, or maybe you've seen a few of his hot takes on LinkedIn or other social channels. So again, really thrilled, Jason, to have you here joining me today to talk all things retail, especially as we start to open things up. So thanks so much for taking the time.
It's so good to see you, Alicia. It's good to see anyone, but it's especially good to catch up with you.
Yeah, even in the digital realm, which I know a lot of us have Zoom fatigue at this point, but always good to get some FaceTime. So to kick things off, Jason, I mean, you've talked quite a bit on LinkedIn about some of the conversations that you're having with retailers right now. A lot of new trends, realities, still some uncertainties as well. Before we pressed record, we were talking about how things are opening up in our own respective areas. So I think that may be a good way to start out, like what kind of conversations you're having with retailers as we start to embark on this reopening process. What's top of mind for them right now?
Yeah. So first of all, wait, you're recording this? I had no idea. Now I'm going to
be.
Yeah. I better be more careful what I say. Yeah, but you're right. Like tons of conversations with retailers and brands that primarily partner with retail. And, there's a lot of changes that we've already seen that retailers are sort of tactically and strategically responding to. There's some changes that maybe we don't feel like we've seen the worst version of, but that we're anticipating in how people will shop and how they'll choose products. So trying to get ready for those things. And then it feels like one of the biggest conversations is the whole debate about which of those changes are permanent versus which ones might be tertiary and revert back. As, for example, now we're starting to open up. And so, will some of the transition to digital abate as people have more choices to go back to a store, for example? So all of those kinds of healthy debates come up a lot as retailers try to figure out what their future is going to look like.
Yeah, I think there are so many layers to this conversation in and of itself. So like you said, we have the longstanding impact of digital. Are we going to see that continuation of growth, or is it going to be as dramatic as it is now? I think the jury's still out on that. But I think the really fascinating debate is around the consumer impact, right? So we saw some people try to minimize spending, either because they're on furlough or laid off, or they just like to go out shopping and they're not doing that right now. So they're kind of putting those behaviors on hold. But then also, there's that inevitable recession conversation too. So those are the two negatives. But then on the positive side, I know I've seen some announcements from retailers that are reopening and they see strong signals of pent-up demand. So there is some spending going on. So a lot of conflicting views, but then a lot of, consumer behavioral realities that I think, lead to a very interesting conversation. So would love your take on what these implications are for retailers and how this may impact, the longer term view of strategy and what retailers need to be thinking about.
Yeah. So, I think you've hit a lot of the big ones. I like to bucket them into a couple buckets because I think there's some common elements. So I tend to talk about these three buckets. Like one bucket is there's a bunch of consumer behaviors that have fundamentally changed primarily because of shelter-in-place orders, right? So you're locked at home, you're not allowed to go out of the house. That caused you to do some things different. Like most obviously, you shop online a heck of a lot more than you did pre-COVID, right? So, depending on whose data set you buy, like 17% of retail was e-commerce before COVID. Now it's like 28%. In a category like grocery, like 3 or 4% was digital pre-COVID. Now it's like 11 or 12%. But other changes because of sheltering in place, like a lot of us learned how to cook, right? So will we stop cooking and rush back to restaurants as soon as possible? Will we go back to restaurants but still cook more because we bought some cookware or an Instapot or something we want to leverage? Most of us, stopped at Best Buy on our way home from work on the last day of, before COVID and bought like a fancy monitor and ordered a comfortable office chair. Our employers probably bought a Zoom account for us. So like, once we're allowed to go back to an office, most of us work from home a little more often to leverage those new at-home capital investments we've made and skills we've acquired. If you bought a Peloton during COVID, like you're less likely to go back to a gym afterwards. And so that first bucket is all of those in-homing behaviors. And if you're in grocery, you care a lot about, is the shift to at-home calorie consumption permanent or not? Because pre-COVID, 60% of calories came from a grocery store, 40% came from restaurants. Now over 90% of your calories are coming from a grocery store. Obviously, grocery stores would like that to be a permanent shift if possible. But then there are also things like, there are these interesting like pantry stocking behaviors, and people are buying more non-perishable items in bigger sizes and keeping them in their pantry. Is that a permanent behavior, or is that tertiary, right? Because that had the potential to mean we sold the year's supply of toilet paper and soup this quarter, and we're not going to sell any toilet paper or soup for the next quarter because people aren't really using those items more quickly than they did before. Or are we always going to keep those stocks? And so like we have permanently transitioned, lots of impacts around that. So that whole first bucket I call the sort of in-homing behaviors. And to me, those are the most uncertain, because there's not really a good historical precedent for us to say, oh man, yes, when this happens, it's always permanent or it's never permanent. We can kind of look at China, where like they had a pretty similar sequester event for SARS in 2002, but the economy was a lot further behind where we are now, and so they definitely leapfrog as a result of being sequestered back then. That doesn't automatically mean that we will here, but for example, e-commerce was born in China because of SARS 10 years or 20 years ago, right? 2002, Alibaba was a $10 million a year company. SARS like drove everyone to buy online. 2 years later, Alibaba sold 1.5 billion. Today, they're like in the hundreds of billions. So you could expect some of those things to play out similarly. But then, as you mentioned, the other big bucket is the recession. We know a lot about historic recessions and how they change consumer behaviors and how we should market and provide shopping experiences in the recession, one thing that feels different about this recession than any historic recession we've looked at is there's this extremely odd bifurcation. Consumer confidence is down. Unemployment is unprecedentedly high, and spending is unprecedentedly low. Income is actually at an all-time high. Like the stock market hasn't really been affected. So folks that have a lot of their economic fortunes tied to the stock market are doing okay. And for wage-based earners, the federal augmentation of the unemployment benefits and the stimulus checks have actually meant that the average income for American families is much higher than usual. So you have this weird thing. Spending's at an all-time low, earnings is actually at an all-time high, and so we have like this unprecedented savings rate. And so as a retailer, what does that mean? How do we talk to a customer? And that is a little bit of an anomaly. And then the third bucket that I don't hear people talking a lot about, but I think is actually going to have a very big impact on shopping is the fundamental changes in the landscape that are likely to play out as a result of this. Like all the independent business retailers that will go out of business and all their volume that will shift to the most healthy major players. The huge unfair, frankly, shift from specialty retailers to essential mass merchants that were the only ones generating revenue over the last 3 months. It's going to put a ton of retailers out of business, and it's going to both change the choice that consumers have, and it's going to change the leverage that the surviving retailers have over their brand partners, right? So I think those landscape differences and how they impact malls and things like that are another interesting factor to factor into your sort of strategic roadmap as a retailer. So those are the three big buckets.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because those three things kind of fuel each other, but then can also go against each other too. So I think that difference between income and actual spending is an interesting one. But then as people begin to spend more, seeing the pivot to, a certain tier, maybe it's top 5 retailers. So thinking about like the Costco's, the Walmarts that were really able to pivot successfully and come out of this, healthily. That's going to be an interesting, domino effect, so to speak, to watch. And I'm wondering if this will impact what the recovery curve kind of looks like for retail as a whole. So because of that volatility, so like businesses, going out of business, declaring bankruptcy, and then also like the consumer realities coming into play, like obviously we're not at a V, right? It's impossible, I feel like, at this point, but like, where do you think this recovery curve is going? What does it look like? And how long do you think it's going to take? Because we're hearing a lot of different things right now.
Yeah. Of course, the correct answer is I have no idea.
Right.
Like the
kind
super
of setting you up
smart
for
people,
failure there. Sorry.
Yeah. The super smart people have no idea. So for sure, the knuckleheads talking about commerce on Twitter have no idea, right?
Right.
I do have the benefit in my role, like we get to talk to a lot of super smart people. So we have like economists on staff that are talking to us about, the things that are likely versus the things that are most uncertain. We're talking to, these scary epidemiologists that like predicted all of this 5 years ago, unfortunately. And you roll all that up, and like what ends up being the best advice for almost everyone is some flavor of what I call scenario planning, right? So it's highly risky to say, here's what the future is going to look like in 18 months. Like, go invest and execute against Jason's picture of the future. That would be crazy. And so what you really have to do is say, like, what are the extremes? Here's one extreme: very fast recovery, consumer confidence rebound, these new behaviors, COVID magically goes away, or we magically invent a cure and give it to 7 billion people overnight. That's one end. The other end is, man, this is really bad for a significant period of time, and it fundamentally, changes how people assess their risk profile to go shopping and things like that. And you really have to be prepared to execute against both ends of that plan. That being said, most of the reasonable scenarios that we go through with clients do not have us like stabilizing at a sort of a post-COVID future for at least 18 months, right? And so most of my clients, at a minimum, are expecting that they're going to be in this semi-normal state, I'll call it, semi-new normal or semi-abnormal, as some of my colleagues call it, at least through the end of 2021, which is, frankly, longer than a lot of consumers and a lot of my clients were necessarily thinking going into these process. Like most people hoped / assumed it would be shorter lived.
Yeah. Well, especially with conversations around, are there going to be several waves of this, and what is going to be the long-term presence before an actual vaccine is released, or even after the fact too, like getting those vaccines rolled out. So I definitely think that makes sense. And, as far as like consumers go, I feel like some of these behaviors are almost going to become innate. Like they're not going to like feel that like, oh, this is a new thing for me. It's just to be like, oh, like this is what's available to me, so this is what I'm going to do. So I want to dig into the conversations that you're having around the future of omnichannel or digital influence specifically, because we talked about the shift to digital overall, that spike. But I'm wondering what behaviors or even expectations from the consumer standpoint are going to have that longevity, because we're seeing retailers do like live streaming, like more like digital based services. So are these going to kind of become table stakes moving forward as we all try to figure out like what's the long-term impact of COVID?
Yeah, so probably in some product categories more than others, but like in general, my top level theme for all of the COVID stuff is I like to call COVID a time machine, right? Like more than it dramatically changed some behaviors and invented new behaviors we've never seen before. What it mostly did is accelerated trends we were already seeing in commerce by 5 years, right? So I like to say, like, we jumped 5 years in 5 minutes. And so a lot of these, both like e-commerce trends and also digitally enabled shopping trends, as you referenced, were trends that we were already seeing. We just didn't expect them to play out quite so fast, right? So, you know, pre-COVID, again, if you use the Forrester data set, 52% of consumer purchase decisions were already digitally influenced, right? So either you bought it via e-commerce, or more likely you used your mobile phone to read ratings and reviews on a site like Amazon, or you used a price checker, or used Google Maps to see if the store was open, or you checked the local store to see if they had something in stock, or maybe you checked a manufacturer's site for ingredients. You had all these digital tools you use. So 50% of all purchase decisions were digitally influenced. Now in the middle of COVID, that's more like 70%, right? And so per your point, those kinds of digital transformations, if you think of it as a time machine, you're probably not going to get back in the time machine and fly back words 5 years after COVID, right? Like that's probably mostly a permanent change. Consumers that have learned how to rely on these digital shopping tools more are likely, for the most part, to permanently adopt them. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the growth in these digital tools are first-time users. So that kind of lends credence to the fact that, like, oh, there was, you know, a cohort of boomers that never grocery shopped online prior to COVID. They started grocery shopping online. And so in general, you'd predict that those things are going to be permanent, and a couple reasons why in a sec. The one mitigating factor is this was a event that we did not have an opportunity to plan for, right? So there were, you know, the volumes we're seeing digitally are greater than holiday season last year. Like the big spikes here are bigger than Cyber Monday spikes. And, you know, we worked for a year to get ready for Cyber Monday. No one was ready for this. And so one of the negative repercussions is a lot of those digital experiences I just mentioned totally suck right now. Like they broke, or we didn't have delivery windows when you want them, or we were out of product and did bad substitution, you know. So a mitigating factor is a lot of customers tried these new digital experiences for the first time, comma, they maybe didn't get the most awesome version of that digital experience because of the capacity planning. And so that might slightly abate how many people permanently adopt these things. But the big thing to me that's likely to lock all these behaviors in is, for the foreseeable future, brick and mortar retailers are not going to be allowed to have as many customers in the store as they're used to. So you're a Costco, busy Saturday afternoon, you have 3,000 customers an hour in that store. Likely through the end of 2021, you're not going to let more than 1,500 customers in that store. So now you're either going to forecast way lower sales this year than you had last year because of that artificial cap on traffic, or you're going to have to do some other things to sell to those customers. And think of, I mean, to sell out, you know, outside of that store. So think about the things you're going to do. The number one thing you're going to do is try to sell the customers curbside, so that you can sell the store's inventory without ever having the customer have to go in your store and take one of your capacity slots. Another thing you're going to do is encourage customers to pre-shop as much as possible. Find out what we have in stock, plan your stuff, build your cart, so that the time in the store is less, so that I can get more customers in the store. In the old world, we used to want traffic in the stores because we knew the more people came in, we'd want dwell time to be high, because the longer they stayed in, they would spend more. Now, I don't want unqualified traffic. I want my best customers to come in the store that are most likely to buy, and I want them to buy a lot fast and get the heck out. And so all of these digital pre-shopping tools and digital influencing tools that we just talked about that were kind of ancillary pre-COVID, now they're super important to a retailer strategy to maximize revenue with an artificial traffic cap on their store. And so because of that, retailers are going to lean into them, customers are going to use them more. And if they use them for 18 months, that for sure is going to ingrain a habit. Customers aren't going to then say, oh, I no longer want this more efficient amenity, and I'm going to, you know, give it up. So I feel like for those reasons, particularly the digital stuff is totally going to get locked in as a permanent change in consumer behavior.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the fact that, a lot of retailers were just trying to pivot as quickly as possible, do something to replicate the in-store experience online. But, there are issues, there are bumps, and some of it just plain sucks. But that kind of leads to, what does the forward-looking strategy look like for these retailers? What are they going to be focusing on? What technologies and experiences are they going to be creating in order to differentiate due to this different playing field that we're all, dealing with right now? So I'm hearing a lot around, obviously, personalization. Those rules are changing. The benefit of like AR and VR type experiences. I mean, it's hard to, especially in this type of climate, to easily navigate like what's going to be hype and what's going to be like a viable business strategy for retailers. But I mean, what kind of conversations are you having? Like what tech is really rising to the top right now? And most of all, how can retailers kind of cut through the clutter and figure out what experiences, especially online, are going to allow them to get that level up in terms of winning that digital dwell time, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. So, and again, I feel like the answer depends a little bit on category. Like there's certain product categories that lend themselves to particular technologies more, like sort of implied in your question that I wholeheartedly agree with. Like a challenge here is a lot of these technologies have real utility and are very exciting for certain retailers in certain circumstances, comma, they're almost all overhyped and oversold as the panacea for all of retail, and understandable why. It's mostly from vendors that sell that technology, right? And it's the old joke, like if you are a hammer salesman, everything looks like a nail, right? And so we hear a lot from all those vendors, and you have to take it with a grain of salt. Like, so a favorite of mine, we've all been conditioned to say AR, VR, and I hate that because I actually think VR is mostly way overhyped and like will only have extreme niche utility for commerce in the next 2 years.
That's fair.
5 or 10 years, potential different story. But for sure, no one's going to walk in a store and want to put on a public headset, right? Like, so.
Not right now, I don't.
Yeah. So COVID fear, like, I mean, we're getting rid of payment systems and touchscreens and any communal devices. So for sure, we're not going to do VR in the store, and not near enough consumers have VR at home for it to be very significant, right? Like if I had to guess, like if VR catches on for anything, it'll be gaming, and then maybe there'll be gaming products that we sell in those games to that niche. But we're not going to be using VR to walk through a virtual grocery store because that was such a precious experience that we, can't live without. AR, I feel like, is super useful and solves some very practical problems that retailers have right now. No consumer on the face of the planet wants to try on public cosmetics right now. You're not going to share the lipstick ever again. You're not going to share those compacts. You're not going to try the in-store samples. So every retailer is heavily leaning into augmented reality try-on for cosmetics, and frankly, the technology has gotten really good. Like in most cases, the customer satisfaction with that virtual try-on is higher than it was with the physical try-on. And so I think you're going to see that was, again, already a trend. You're seeing it wildly accelerate. L'Oreal bought a company that does this, Modiface, and they actually just deployed it on Amazon in Canada. So if you're shopping for cosmetics from L'Oreal on Amazon, you get the virtual try-on experience using technology provided by L'Oreal, which is pretty remarkable that Amazon is using a vendor's technology to improve the product detail page is relatively unprecedented as far as I'm aware. So that's a case where AR is going to make a lot of sense. Fitment and using technology to improve fitment. So there's a bunch of reasons apparel is going to be a mess for a long time. Like there were a lot of headwinds in apparel before. Fast forward 5 years, and apparel is really a rough category right now. And what apparel there is mostly being sold online, or retailers are going to try to pivot to curbside. Generally, when you don't try on apparel before you buy it, returns are very high, and so the unit economics totally suck, right? So we already had a lot of apparel being sold via e-commerce before COVID. It just wasn't profitable because much of it got returned. So if we're going to have a world where people buy apparel, we're going to have to find better ways to help people get the right size without trying stuff on. And a lot of that comes down to using technology to test fitment, right? And so the right now is a device on the market. The newest iPad Pro like has actual LiDAR in it for hyper accurate measurements. That's likely to come out in the next iPhones. We're probably going to see a bunch of retailers using that kind of technology to help customers measure their body for apparel. Nike has really evolved the technology for shoe fitment, even without the LiDAR. Just using the smartphone camera, they feel like they can more accurately measure your foot than you could on that old school slider technology that we all experienced at Foot Locker in our lifetimes. So I think that kind of technology will play out. I've mentioned curbside a bunch of times. And so geolocation technologies around really optimizing the pickup experience and reducing friction from pickup is going to be a big deal. Groceries, one of the biggest categories being disrupted by all this. The unit economics for digital grocery are really challenging if the store has to pay a kid to pick the 120 items off the shelf and put them in the bag for you. So micro fulfillment centers that dramatically improve the picking efficiency for digital grocery orders is a trend that was already starting before COVID that now we're seeing rapidly accelerating. And then as customers return to stores, one of the problems is we're going to want to encourage them to touch the products less. And so that means less reading the point of purchase materials on the back of the package. It means less picking up the sweater to see what size it is and to feel the fabric and all of these things. And so we're going to have to replace all that information people got from physical point of purchase with digital information. And the most economical way to do that is to deliver that digital information to the customer's own device, their phone, while they're in the store. So a lot of the sort of digitally enabled in-store shopping via mobile phone, I feel like is a really rich technology category. And then I've given you a long list, but the last one I would throw out there is one of the ramifications of having half the traffic in your store is your in-store labor is now way less efficient. So what are you going to do? Have half as many people working in the store, or just have a more expensive store that serves less customers? The best solution is, can those store employees extend their presence outside the store? So we're starting to see a lot of brands and retailers lean into telepresence. So you can go to Gucci and get a concierge to demonstrate products for you and have a private video chat with you at home as a pre-shopping experience, leveraging store employees from a store. And I feel like that's going to be a more common solution in a lot of categories.
Yeah. And I think it really connects to that digital physical integration story that's been ever present in retail for quite some time now, but is underpinned by these new scenarios that we're shopping in, the new considerations and concerns that consumers have, but also, business leaders as well, not just concerns, but requirements, right? In order to keep their stores open. These are things that, retailers need to do or need to play into to develop their strategy, which, you laid out a lot of really great examples there, which was really helpful, I think, for everyone watching right now. But I feel like all of these factors kind of play into this narrative of what does the future of the store look like, or more specifically, the future of the retail real estate market. I mean, going back to your point earlier, even around gyms, like if everyone's trying to embrace, digital live streaming, their Peloton, there's the Mirror, which is like a whole other, brand within that realm. Are we going to start to see, more vacancies, and what is that domino effect? I mean, do you have a viewpoint as far as what this means for the future of real estate specifically, or is it still too early to kind of see how this all shakes out?
Well, I think it's for sure too early to know everything. Like you can have some hypotheses which I think I added way too many isses to that, but you get the idea. You can have some hypotheses, but going in and for sure, for a variety of economic reasons, we're going to have way fewer stores. A ton of stores are going to close. Yeah. Like my personal estimate is like 25% of all the retail square footage in the US is going to permanently close because of COVID. And at first you're like, oh my God, that's like unimaginable. That's going to dramatically reduce GDP and reduce retail sales if we lose a quarter of our stores. And the thing I have to remind US consumers of is we have wildly more retail square footage in the US than anywhere else. So depending on how you count, we have about 24.5 square feet of retail space for every man, woman, and child in the US. Wow. Europe has 4 square feet of space. Mm-hmm. So if we lop off a quarter of our retail space, we still have way more retail space than anyone else. So closing all those stores probably doesn't affect demand for products so much. It absolutely affects access in certain markets, right? So we already have like a lot of catastrophic, what we call food deserts in the US, where there's not a real grocery store within 2 miles of someone. As a lot of independent grocery stores go away, we'll see that those problems exacerbate. And what it means is you'll have to turn more to a mass merchant that has a lot of different categories for your basic fulfillment needs, and you'll have to turn online for more of those fulfillment needs, right? So you'll see a couple people thrive on that demand, but the retailers that survive probably are going to need less square footage than they used to have, right? Like if you think of a lot of what we call specialty retailers today, their actual original value prop was assortment, right? Like if you were used to a mom and pop hardware store, Home Depot's value prop was, we have way more hammers than your mom and pop hardware store. And people like that assortment and went there. Today, Amazon has many more hammers than Home Depot, right? And so assortment no longer wins. And same story in office products, same story in most specialty categories. There still is a role for specialty retailers, but it's probably way less around that assortment because of all the capacity problems we just talked about, the economics of having a really big store to carry 30 different kinds of hammers may not in the long term make sense for Home Depot. All of these retailers have products in them that drive traffic that are that weren't very profitable, but we used as traffic drivers. And now we don't want traffic anymore. We just want qualified traffic, right? So at Kohl's, you might have had a big counter for Amazon returns, and it was this really novel program that everybody complimented. It got Amazon customers to come to Kohl's and maybe they'd buy something when they were doing a return. Well, if Kohl's isn't allowed to let more customers in the store, who do they want to come in the store? Someone that's shopping for their wardrobe or someone that's coming to do an Amazon return, right? Like a lot of those traffic drivers go away. That means a lot of product categories go away, and the retailer wants to focus on the high value, fast moving SKUs. So assortment for a lot of retailers shrinks, means the square footage shrinks, it means the labor shrinks. And so I do think looking at the future of real estate, we've got big stores that cater to big audiences and have a breadth, right? And that's mostly the Targets and Walmarts of the world. And then we're gonna have specialty retail really contract and really focus on service and curation. And so, that is gonna be a different atmosphere than what we're used to today when we have such an abundance of stores.
Yeah, no, I think there are some great points there. And I think it'll be interesting to see what approach different retailers take and how that kind of aligns to their value prop, the type of services and experiences they're trying to take, for consumers, especially as we think more long-term, because I'm sure there are a lot of conversations taking place right now around what is our brand promise now. So wow. I would love to be a fly on the wall with those conversations, because I'm sure there are some tough conversations taking place right now. No, this has been fantastic, Jason. So I think, before we close out, I feel like all of the trends that we've been talking about today kind of ladder up to those strategic conversations, talking about how are we going to best serve the customer, but also how we're going to be working and collaborating internally. So we've been hearing a lot around new collaborative imperatives, the need for agility, so on and so forth. So digital transformation, things that we've been talking about again for a while, but like you said, we hopped into the time machine, things kind of accelerated forward. So are you having any conversations to help guide retailers through these new processes or new ways of looking at their business, like through the lens of digital transformation? And if so, are there any lessons or takeaways that maybe our audience can glean to start having those tough conversations?
Yeah, that's a meaty topic. There's a little bit of a dichotomy there, right? Because on the one hand, the imperative is greater than ever, right? Change and adapt or die, for sure, right? And the pace of adoption has gotten much faster. Again, we accelerated 5 years. So if you thought you had a nice leisurely ramp to like survive this digital business transformation, you just lost a lot of your ramp. You may have thought you were going to retire and your successor was going to solve that digital problem. Now it's your problem, right?
Yeah.
Or you got to accelerate your retirement quite a bit. So on the one hand, there's more of an imperative, and like retailers are more interested in systemically solving for those problems. On the other hand, because of the recession, retailers are in extreme austerity mode, right? Like there's a lot of evidence that the number one factor that causes you to survive a recession is liquidity. So sell everything you can, get as much cash in the bank as you can, cancel as many non-essential initiatives as you can, right? And so for a lot of retailers, that meant the long-term investments I was making on innovation, these like business strategy functions, these org change management functions that were super valuable, were victims of austerity measures. So in some ways, retailers have less of the folks that would ordinarily be the shepherds of those initiatives. And so in some cases, it makes it harder for the retailer to take on formal versions of those projects. In other cases, it means they have to rely more on outside entities like the agencies in the Publicis portfolio and others. So, it's potentially beneficial to the consulting industry. But also, there's always a struggle at every retailer between urgent and important. Digital business transformation is important. Holiday revenue is urgent. There's an extreme version of that. The urgent stuff feels more urgent and more life and death right now. So, frankly, like there are a lot of retailers and brands that would understand the imperative to transform, they don't feel like they have the bandwidth to focus on big picture transformation, and they're really focused on tactics that will benefit them in the short term and that will ladder up to a transformation. So if I'm being honest and realistic, there's good lip service about transformation, but there are some endemic barriers at the moment to it really leaning in. That being said, the most interesting thing to me is when you do have this disruption that jumps you 5 years in the future, it totally changes your perspective on a lot of things, right? So I laugh at some of these things. I can virtually assure you there was a quarterly meeting at Best Buy for the last 10 years. Curbside pickup, should we do it or not, right? And every time in that meeting, you can imagine the debate. Oh man, customers would love it. It's a nice amenity. Like, we have all the ingredients in place to do it. And someone else is like, yeah, but when they walk in the store, they discover other stuff to buy and they spend more money with us. And if we put a bunch of inventory out on the parking lot, we're going to have shrink problems and theft. Here are all the reasons not to do it. So they have that debate every quarter, and you'll note Best Buy never had a curbside pickup solution, right? So fast forward to COVID-19, in 48 hours, Best Buy deployed curbside pickup to 800 stores. Like, if I would have visited pre-COVID Best Buy and said, not only are you going to do curbside pickup, but you're going to do it over a weekend, they would have said, dude, what planet are you on? You're high. Like, we don't move that fast. That's not possible. Right. And mother being the necessity of invention, they figured out a way to do it. And a lot of other retailers have maybe slightly less extreme versions of that. Things that were unimaginably fast and transformative before are now the new normal for a lot of these retailers. And that is encouraging in terms of retailers preparing for the future and being more agile.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the distinction between important versus urgent, especially because I know, just looking at the calendar now, at around this time, this is when we would start to be talking about holiday strategies. So I'm sure people are like, how do I even think about this? How do I fast track this in a way that makes sense? So I can't even imagine, thinking like a year to 18 months out around transforming the business. However, to your point, I feel like there have been so many cases of, businesses really pivoting, to use another buzzword, fast tracking things that they never thought would be possible because they didn't have any other options. So it'll be interesting to see if we see more blips of that, especially if we have, more waves of COVID or what that looks like. I know, Apple just reclosed more stores in certain markets because of new spikes. So I guess, like many things in our conversation today, this is a big let's wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, that is funny. Like the most common conversation I have is that tactical conversation around holiday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the folks I talk to have solved this week's problems. Like they've figured out how to safely operate a store in the environment they're allowed to operate it in right now. They've fixed their most acute digital supply chain problems, capacity problems, and what they're most laser focused on is, what the heck are we going to do for holiday? What is holiday going to look like? And the answer is really unsatisfying, right? Like none of us know. And so, that scenario planning conversation, are you, are parents going to dress up their kids and send them out to get candy from strangers for Halloween?
Right.
I doubt it, right? Are families going to travel to visit their extended families for Christmas and celebrate Christmas together and therefore do a big gift exchange? Historically, if they don't, they're not going to be as generous. Like you're more generous when you're facing those relatives than you are remotely, right? And so is demand going to be an all-time high this Christmas because we've all been sequestered and there's like this pressure cooker of demand that's going to uncork, and we're all depressed and we're going to use retail therapy as a means of treating our depression, and it's going to be the greatest holiday season ever? That's a viable scenario. Or are we all going to jack up our savings rates because we're worried about getting a job or keeping our job, and we're not depressed and not going to see as many family members, so we're not going to spend as much on holiday gifts, and is it going to be and by the way, is the retail supply chain all screwed up for holiday, and there's no holiday apparel and all those things, and as a result, are we going to have a really poor holiday? That's also a totally viable scenario, right? And so as a retailer, man, you've got the difficult job of being super agile and scenario planning for those two extremes and having some plays ready, right, for both extremes.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm sure holiday is a whole other conversation, and maybe we'll have that conversation when we get there. But for now, Jason,
if anyone watching knows the answer, please send it to me, because I would love to know.
And me too, because I want to know and I want to talk to you. But for now, I think we covered a lot of great ground. So thank you for being so transparent about the conversations you're having, what you find to be urgent versus important, and how retailers can better prioritize. Before I let you go, where can folks go to get more insights from you around all things retail?
Oh my God. In the highly unlikely event anyone wants to get more info from me, I feel like I'm already heavily exposed, but the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. I have that Retail Geek tag, so you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, any of those things. And of course, my much smarter co-host, Scott Wingo, and I have a weekly podcast called The Jason and Scott Show. And so we talk about very similar themes like every week on the podcast, and people are welcome to listen in and give us their feedback there as well.
Yep, it's definitely a great show. Definitely check it out. Add it to your podcast list, because I'm sure a lot of folks are doing stuff like that right now. So Jason, again, thank you so much for taking the time out. A lot of really great insights. Really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad you're doing well, and I look forward to being able to see you in person at some point in the future.
Yes. I mean, knock wood. We'll see how all that shakes out. So thank you again so much for taking the time out. And thanks everyone out there for watching. As always, if you have feedback on this episode or any others, drop us a line on Twitter, and don't forget to check out all of the other great insights we have on the Retail Reset Hub. Thanks again, everyone, and take care.